Overnight, millions of Americans woke up in total darkness. No electricity, no heat, no power. The sudden blackout across the country left citizens scrambling for answers. What could have caused such a massive disruption? Was it a cyber attack? Well, the real answer was even more shocking. America's closest neighbor and longtime ally Canada had just cut off power to all Republican-led states, throwing Trump's heartland into chaos. And the most stunning part? No one, not even Donald Trump himself, saw it coming. How did Canada go from being America's polite, dependable northern neighbor to launching a bold economic strike that crippled millions overnight? More importantly, what happens next? Buckle up, because this is a retaliation story for the ages. The tariff that started it all. It all began with one of Donald Trump's biggest economic power plays, tariffs. In a move that stunned economists and sent shockwaves through global markets, Trump announced a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, a direct hit on one of America's largest trade partners. But that was just the beginning. Weeks later, he doubled down, raising the tariff to 50%, a move that left Canada blindsided and outraged. Trump, however, was unfazed. To him, this was a strategic maneuver to reshape America's economic dominance. Standing before his supporters, he made his intentions clear. We're gonna bring in hundreds of billions of dollars. Canada, they spend very little. We're gonna make America richer than ever before. At first, it seemed like just another trade war, one of many aggressive policies from an administration known for its hardline stance on foreign trade. But what Trump didn't realize was that he had just poked a sleeping giant. Behind the scenes, Canadian leaders weren't just angry, they were quietly preparing their counterattack. And when it came, it would shake the very foundation of Trump's support base. While Washington celebrated its tariff victory, Toronto was plotting its response, and leading the charge, Doug Ford, the fiery premier of Ontario. Unlike Trump, Ford wasn't interested in empty rhetoric. He wanted action, and he was about to unleash a retaliation so devastating that it would leave Trump's strongest supporters reeling. The trade war had just turned into an energy war. Ontario's cold-blooded retaliation. Doug Ford, Ontario's premier, a leader known for his no-nonsense attitude and refusal to back down from a fight. When Trump announced the crippling tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, Ford wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting, bringing together top officials and industry leaders. His message was simple but firm. If Trump wants a trade war, we'll give him one, and we're going to hit them where it hurts. At first, the room was filled with frustration and anger, but then someone pointed out a staggering fact, one that would change the course of this economic standoff. Half of America's critical mineral supply, including high-grade nickel and uranium, essential for manufacturing and energy production, comes from Ontario. If Canada restricted these exports, it would cripple industries across the US, but Ford wasn't done yet. There was an even bigger weapon in Canada's arsenal, one that few Americans even realized they depended on: electricity. Canada supplies 30% of America's power, and over half of that flows directly to red states. Trump's stronghold, the Midwest, the South, and key industrial hubs all rely on cheap Canadian energy to keep their economies running. The message from Ontario was loud and clear: mess with Canada and you'll wake up in the dark, and that's exactly what happened next. The blackout that shook America. On March 4th, just weeks after Trump doubled down on his tariffs, Ontario delivered its promised retaliation. With a single executive order, Canada halted power exports to all Republican-led states that had backed Trump's crippling tariff policies. It was an unprecedented move, a political and economic shockwave that would send millions of Americans into a crisis they never saw coming. For decades, American cities, particularly in the Midwest and the South, had depended on Canada's steady and affordable electricity. It was a lifeline that powered factories, hospitals, businesses, and homes. But overnight, that lifeline was severed. Entire regions woke up to pitch-black streets, silent factories, and homes without heat or running water. The United States had never faced an energy crisis quite like this, and the fallout was immediate. As news spread, confusion quickly turned to outrage and fear. At first, local officials assured the public that this was just a temporary glitch, a problem that could be fixed within hours. But as time passed, the truth became undeniable. Canada had shut the power off deliberately. Without electricity, chaos erupted across major US cities. Hospitals were the first to sound the alarm. While some had backup generators, fuel reserves were limited, and without a steady supply of power, ICU units, ventilators, and life-saving medical equipment were were at risk of failure. Doctors and nurses rushed to transfer critical patients to unaffected areas, but with entire states in darkness, there were few safe havens left. In industrial states like Tennessee, Kentucky, and Texas, major factories shut down, leading to millions of dollars in immediate losses. With production lines stalled, thousands of workers were sent home with no idea when or if they would return. Food processing plants lost refrigeration, causing massive stock losses in supermarkets and wholesale suppliers. Local businesses were hit just as hard. Without power, ATMs stopped working, gas stations couldn't pump fuel, and restaurants were forced to close. The disruption spread like wildfire. From Memphis to Miami, people lined up at grocery stores only to find their debit and credit cards useless without electronic payment systems. On the streets, frustration turned into full-blown panic. In Louisiana, residents packed city hall meetings demanding answers. In Nashville, truck drivers found themselves stranded, unable to refuel. In Oklahoma City, small business owners took to news networks, venting their anger at Washington's failure to act. One factory owner, his business at a complete standstill, shouted into the camera, "We can't run a country like this. What the hell is going on?" Meanwhile, as millions of Americans struggled to navigate the crisis, Canada remained silent and unyielding. From across the border, Ontario's officials watched and waited, arms crossed, refusing to budge. They weren't asking for negotiations. They weren't offering compromises. They wanted one thing, an apology. And until they got it, the lights would stay off. Trump's desperate response. Trump was furious. The moment news of the blackout crisis reached the White House, he exploded in rage. Advisors braced themselves for the inevitable outburst as he stormed into the Oval Office, demanding answers. How had this happened? How had America, a global superpower, been brought to its knees by Canada? Taking to social media, Trump unleashed a firestorm of tweets, blaming Canada for what he called an unthinkable betrayal. He accused the Trudeau government of waging an economic war against the United States, vowing swift and severe retaliation. His usual fiery rhetoric was in full force, attempting to rally his base and project strength. But as the hours passed, it became clear that angry tweets wouldn't bring the power back. The crisis was deepening, and the backlash was growing. Across Republican-led states, governors were in a panic. Calls flooded into the White House from business leaders, factory owners, and hospital administrators, all demanding immediate action. The situation was no longer just a trade dispute. It was a full-scale economic emergency. In response, an emergency White House meeting was called, bringing together Trump's top economic and national security advisors. The room was tense as officials pored over grim reports from across the country. One thing was painfully clear: America needed Canadian electricity, period. Without it, factories would shut down indefinitely, food supplies would be disrupted, and entire industries would grind to a halt. In states like Texas, Tennessee, and Louisiana, manufacturing plants had already been forced to send workers home. Every hour of lost productivity was costing millions in damages. Small businesses were suffering, unable to process transactions without power. And most dangerously, hospitals were running out of emergency fuel to keep critical care units operational. But the worst part? This crisis was hitting Trump's most loyal voters. The Midwest and Southern states, his electoral strongholds, were collapsing under the weight of the blackout. With an election on the horizon, the political fallout could be catastrophic. If power wasn't restored quickly, Trump risked losing the very states that had propelled him into office. For perhaps the first time in his presidency, Trump found himself cornered. His America First policy had backfired in the most unexpected way, and now the only way out was to reverse course. His advisors, many of whom had championed the tariffs, now urged him to de-escalate. They warned him that Canada held all the leverage, and unless he acted fast, the US economy could face a prolonged collapse. And so, in a move that shocked even his most loyal supporters, Trump made a stunning reversal. With a single announcement, he suspended the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, the very policy he had championed. The economic weapon he had wielded so aggressively was now being abandoned. It was a humiliating climb down, a clear admission that Canada had won this round. For a man who had built his reputation on never backing down, this was nothing short of a public defeat. The White House scrambled to control the narrative, but the damage had already been done. Trump had been forced to bend the knee to Canada, and the world was watching. Now, the question remained, would this concession be enough to turn the lights back on, or had Canada just proven that even a superpower could be humbled? The global impact and China's sneaky move. Trump's tariff war with Canada had set off a chain reaction, crippling industries, shutting down factories, and leaving millions in the dark. But as America scrambled to recover, another global superpower was quietly making its move. Because the real winner in this crisis, China. While Trump was locked in a bitter standoff with Canada, Beijing saw an opening. The Chinese government, always looking for ways to reduce its dependence on Western energy sources, seized the moment. Within days of the US-Canada trade war escalating, Chinese diplomats and business leaders landed in Ottawa with a simple message: we'll take what the US doesn't want. In a bold and strategic maneuver, China offered to buy Canadian oil and energy exports at record high prices, a deal too good for Canada to ignore. Tired of being treated as America's punching bag, Canada said yes. With that decision, history shifted. For the first time ever, Canada began redirecting its vast energy exports away from the US and toward China. Oil, uranium, hydroelectric power, resources that had long powered American cities and industries, were now flowing across the Pacific instead. And that was a move America might never recover from, because while Trump had been focused on winning against Canada, he had unknowingly handed China one of the biggest economic victories of the decade. With a reliable, resource-rich ally now in its corner, Beijing was strengthening its energy independence, weakening America's grip on global trade, and reshaping the balance of power for years to come. So what does this all mean? Trump's aggressive tariff strategy was meant to establish America's dominance over Canada, forcing its northern neighbor into submission. Instead, it backfired spectacularly. What began as a trade dispute spiraled into a full-blown energy crisis, one that crippled key Republican states, disrupted industries, and sent the White House into emergency mode. But while millions of Americans suffered blackouts, Canada came out stronger than ever. By cutting power to Trump's heartland, it exposed America's hidden reliance on its northern neighbor, proving that when pushed too far, Canada had the power to fight back and win. Even more shocking was China's strategic victory. While Trump was focused on punishing Canada, Beijing saw an opportunity and took it. By securing access to Canadian oil and energy, China strengthened its global position, reducing its dependence on American resources and cementing a new trade alliance that could shift power for decades. In the end, Trump didn't just lose a trade war, he triggered an economic realignment that left America weaker on the world stage. Canada got richer, China got stronger, and Trump's biggest supporters, they were left in the dark, literally.